Hi, my name is Rachel Jones, Manager of Trauma-Informed Treatment with the Missouri Department of Mental Health in the Division of Behavioral Health. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I am pleased to be with you today to talk about trauma-informed special education. Our learner outcomes for today's session are, first, to understand types of trauma and how they impact students, families, your school staff, and communities. Also, we'll learn the 12 indicators of a trauma-informed school based on the Missouri model for trauma-informed schools. And then we'll identify strategies that special education administrators can implement to advance trauma-informed special education in your district. Let's begin with some terminology. Many times when people hear trauma-informed, their mind goes to trauma-informed services. But it's really important to understand trauma-informed care and trauma-informed services are different, but need to both be happening at the same time. Trauma-informed care is the framework that a school district or a school building would use, and they would consider how trauma impacts their population. They would begin changing their policies, procedures, and practices to align with what we know about trauma-informed. On the other hand, trauma-informed services are specific to individuals or groups. Maybe it's a classroom intervention or a specific type of assessment or some evidence-based practice. But it is the way that we deliver a specific service to someone in a trauma-informed way. So as I mentioned, both need to exist within a school system in order for it to become trauma-informed. Trauma-informed care also talks about using a trauma lens. It helps us change our question. Typically, we are asking the question, what's wrong with you? We're thinking about diagnosis, behavior problems, a student's reputation or history, maybe a family's reputation or history. And so it's very deficit-based. The trauma-informed lens shifts the question to what happened to you. When we begin to ask what happened to you, we start to get to the foundation of what's really going on, what's driving behaviors, symptoms, and problems that underline trauma or toxic stress. Eventually, when a person who has experienced a trauma recovers, they may be in a position to advocate for others and use their lived experience to connect to other people in similar situations. And so this is the trauma-informed lens. Let's define trauma. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA, has done a lot of groundbreaking work around trauma-informed. They define trauma as an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual. And these can be physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. These events have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in various areas, such as mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Also, SAMHSA identifies 3 E's. This helps us understand how trauma can be a very individualized experience for a person. First, you have the event. It's an actual threat or perceived threat of physical or psychological harm. And then you have the experience. It's how the person assigns meaning to that event. For example, was it traumatic? Was it a difficult circumstance? Was it so normal they didn't think twice about it? The experience can be varying degrees depending on the individual. And then last, you have the effects. And this is the result of the person's experience of the event. And this may include neurological effects, physical, emotional, or cognitive. Those effects may be short-term. They may occur over a period of years. They may ebb and flow and emerge and subside. And so we know that two people can be exposed to the same traumatic event, but have very different responses and very different effects across their life. Here are some examples of trauma. As you can see from the list, these examples include personal trauma that's happening to an individual. They can be one-time traumatic events. They can also be collective traumas that are happening to whole groups of people at the same time. Some of these traumas are based on culture, history, maybe generational within a family system. And so if a child or a family has multiple examples of these traumas show up in their life, we consider that complex trauma. Some people may have only one single incident exposure to a traumatic event. Others might have a series of traumas since the very beginning of time that they can remember. And others may do very well for a period of time and then experience a few traumas that happen back to back to back. So again, trauma is so individualized, but it's good for us to know the broad spectrum of what trauma can be in a person's life. Re-traumatization is also an important concept to understand in trauma-informed care work. Re-traumatization is just discussing ways that systems are designed and the way that they work with people who have behavioral problems, mental health problems, or who don't follow their rules. So they have policies, procedures, and practices that are put in place that will oftentimes trigger a person who has already experienced trauma. The top row is a good example of the policies, procedures, and practices, and these are system-induced re-traumatizations. The bottom row on this screen are what I like to refer to as emotional re-traumatization. It's the way that we talk to people or we talk about them, whether we believe them or not, whether we shame and blame them, whether we dismiss and invalidate their traumatic experiences. So it's helpful for us to understand what re-traumatization might look like in our systems and in our individual practices. Discipline is an important conversation to have when thinking about becoming trauma-informed. What you see on your screen comes from the Education Law Center, and this is the cycle of trauma as it relates to discipline. First, at the top, you have the traumatic event. From there, a person will develop emotional or psychological damage of some sort, and then they will act out with certain behaviors. And then if the response to the behavior is to punish, depending on the way in which we go about punishing someone, we may re-traumatize them, and that cycle starts all over again. So in schoolwork and thinking about becoming a trauma-informed school and thinking about how do we respond to behaviors, we have to be very cautious to find the middle ground. We want to hold people accountable and discipline when necessary, but not use discipline as a way to punish. Rather, we want to use it as a way to teach. And we want to do it in a most compassionate way so that we can try to understand what is the traumatic event underneath the emotional damage and the behavior outburst. We also can't really talk about trauma-informed special education without talking about the educators and other school personnel. They work so hard to serve so many children. So So workplace trauma can be very uncomfortable to discuss, but it's also a very real part of the profession. This information comes from Workplace Strategies for Mental Health. And they've done some research around some of the things that occur within the workplace that are traumatizing. And were it not for the work that a person does for a living, they may not even be exposed to these types of traumas. So if you think about the workforce that comes to school every day to serve so many students and their families, they may be struggling with their own list of traumatic events that occurred in their history or might be occurring right now. They're trying to assist a student who may also have significant amount of trauma in their life. And the interactions and the environment and the pressure can also create trauma within the workplace. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study has provided us a lot of wonderful information about the connection between what happens in childhood and how that can follow a child into adulthood, leading to chronic health problems, negative social problems, and a variety of other challenges in adulthood. The original ACEs study was done in the mid-1990s. And if you're not familiar with the ACEs study, I encourage you to look into it. You can find it easily from the cdc.gov website. The original study asked 17,000 adults in the state of California about their childhood experiences. And they simply asked a question, were you exposed to any of these things prior to age 18? For every answer of yes, that person would add 1 to their ACE score. Over time, they kind of developed these 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and then household dysfunction. What the research indicated then and what has been replicated since that time is that the increased score equals an increased risk in those negative health and social outcomes, such as alcoholism and drug use, chronic health problems like heart and liver disease, obesity, diabetes, mental health problems like depression and suicide attempts, academic problems like poor academic achievement and dropout, and then poor work performance or unemployment, as well as multiple sexual partners and unplanned pregnancies, exposure to domestic violence as victims or perpetrators, and legal problems. Eventually, this research was also conducted, and it looked beyond just those adverse childhood experiences, which were oftentimes private, traumatic, toxic situations happening within family systems. And it looked at, what about community events that are also traumatic? Those collective traumas that are happening to whole groups of people or marginalized people. How can a family recover from adverse experiences if even within their own community, the resources and the exposure that they have to additional adversity makes it harder for them to recover or potentially re-traumatizes them? And so this is important work to think about how our systems can become more trauma-informed to address the community access to resources to help people recover. So next we want to talk a bit about the impact of childhood trauma. As you can see from this slide, the impact is broad, and keep in mind that this may impact certain children in certain ways, and other children may not be impacted at all in these areas. But we know from brain scans that childhood trauma impacts the way a brain is built, the way it grows, how it forms, and even what size it is. We also know that that influences their ability to learn language, solve problems, be ready for school, and concentrate. Trauma isn't just about what a person remembers and what they think. It also impacts their physical health care. So we see correlations to sleep disorders, eating disorders, an impaired immune system, which makes children more susceptible to illness, and it takes them longer to recover, as well as a shorter lifespan over the course of life. One of the most critical ways that childhood trauma impacts children is in their relationships with others. It can be very difficult for them to have healthy attachments to adults and peers. They also can struggle reading social cues, forming healthy relationships, even being able to recognize a healthy relationship. And of course, if they're exposed to intergenerational cycles of abuse, then the way that relationships are done in their home that seem normal to them may be very unhealthy and traumatizing. In other areas like mental health, we see that childhood trauma impacts the rates of depression and suicide, as well as anxiety. Some children will be formally diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but others won't. They may have developmental trauma that eventually gets diagnosed in many other ways, like having ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder or a conduct disorder or an intermittent explosive disorder, separation anxiety, and the list goes on. But it's important to understand that if a child is exposed to trauma in infancy, toddlerhood, or early childhood before they even enter the school system, then we call that developmental trauma. It has a very significant impact on their ability to learn and their ability to communicate with others. We also know that trauma impacts behavior. Sometimes they'll have difficulties controlling their impulses. Sometimes they'll withdraw from others. Or maybe they're being aggressive toward themselves and other people, destroying property, maybe taking risks. Emotionally, they may have trouble recognizing and naming their emotions and regulating. They may have a considerable amount of shame and guilt and a sense of helplessness, like they can't help themselves and nothing's going to get better. They may have limited coping skills and not really know or feel confident that they could use coping skills in a good way. And perception. When a young person has experienced trauma, it changes their worldview. Is this world a safe place for me? Can I protect myself if the adults in my life won't? Can I trust that other people are going to do what they say that they're going to do and that they won't hurt me or leave me? Was it my fault? Is this person who says that they want to help me, will they really help me? Can I trust that that's what will really happen? These are just some of the ways that a worldview for a young child who's been exposed to toxic stress and childhood trauma shifts. And educators meet with them in the classrooms or maybe virtually or at different events. You may not realize how their worldview has shifted. And so it may be very difficult to connect with them, to support, and to know ways to help them. We also know that trauma has a real impact on students being ready for school. You'll see absences and tardies, classroom disruption if they get triggered by something that's happened in the classroom that reminds them of another time when they were out of control and things happened to them that they couldn't protect themselves. Problems with unstructured time is very common for youth that have trauma. Sometimes we consider them overreacting to a situation. What the trauma-informed science teaches us about how our brains work is they may be in survival brain mode. Their fight, flight, freeze response may be activated numerous times throughout a day. They may not be able to explain it to us, and we may not know what exactly it was that activated that stress response. So to us, it might seem like they're overreacting. To them, they might be desperately trying to protect themselves from something that they perceive as harmful. We also may see aggression or defiance, withdrawal, isolation, sleeping in class, refusing to do work, and perfectionism, really wanting to do something exactly right and being very afraid that if they can't get it right, something bad could happen. Trauma has an impact on parent-school interactions as well. Sometimes caregivers have their own history of trauma, and it may be something that happened to them in the past that they don't deal with anymore, but it could be ongoing trauma and ongoing stress. The parent or caregiver may have had a negative experience in school themselves. So when their child begins to struggle, and when their child needs help, and when the school reaches out to them, they may not feel the confidence or the safety to address some of those old wounds that they had themselves connected to the school system. There may be other logistical things like fear of job loss, fear that they will lose their income and not be able to support their child or other children in the home. They may have problems with tracking and remembering information. They may not have time in their day, the energy to do what they want or need to do, or the resources that would help them do those things. So it's important for us when we are talking about caregiver and parent connections to the schools, it's important for us to use that trauma-informed lens for the caregiver as well. When we ask what happened, and we start to learn some of the challenges that families are up against, then that changes the dialogue, and it can be much more productive, where we can arrive at solutions and help them build protective factors instead of assuming the worst intent and assuming that their behavior has something to do with their character or their parenting style. So now let's shift to the Missouri model. I'd like to introduce this model to you. This is a developmental model that can help any professional or organization learn how to become trauma-informed. In general, most of us start out in the gray column where we are pre-aware. This is before we've ever really heard much about trauma-informed. We maybe don't know the science behind it. And so the way that we do business every day has never really taken into account the role that trauma plays. And so many times we would re-traumatize. It's not intentional, but it happens when our policies, procedures, and practices don't take into account the role that trauma can play in a student or a family's life and how they may be interacting with the school system. So the next phase would be trauma aware. This is when we begin to get information about trauma and recovery. We start to understand the prevalence. We start to look at our population and say, wow, now that I think about it, there might be a lot of kids that are in my classroom that are experiencing trauma, and I never saw it as that. I wonder if we need to do something different. I wonder if that might explain this situation that happened. And so informal discussions begin to emerge at the trauma aware stage because people are starting to apply what they've learned about trauma, especially the science behind it, and they're applying that to the day-to-day interactions that they begin to see. They're changing the question. Next phase is trauma sensitive. And here is where the school is beginning to start to operationalize things. They're learning about trauma-informed principles. They're adopting those principles and really trying to use them to help make some decisions and some sustainable long-term change. They're identifying leaders to form a committee to set some strategic plans in place so that the district can move toward becoming trauma-informed. And at this stage, many school districts are also conducting an organizational self-assessment. They're asking all of the employees within the school district to look at the way that it operates and figure out what areas do we do this really well, what areas are needing some improvement, and what areas have we not even recognized before that we could implement trauma-informed and see some improvements. And so at that trauma-sensitive stage, as you can hear, it's getting more organized, it's getting more intentional and purposeful, and there's some strategic planning that's now being put in place. The next phase is trauma responsive. At this phase, you're beginning to restructure some of those practices and procedures and regulations and policies. And I'll be honest, sometimes the conversations are quite controversial. After all, this is how things have always been done. And now we're asking for it to change. Not everybody is going to be comfortable with that change or understand it. At the trauma responsive phase, it's really important for everyone in the organization, no matter what role they play, whether they're a paraprofessional, a part-time staff, someone who has direct access to students, someone who's in a support position or an administrative and leadership position. They all have shared language that they use about trauma-informed. They all understand the basics of trauma. They understand what to look for and what the signs and symptoms are. They know what trauma-informed principles are, and they're all working toward a common goal. That's a very important part of the puzzle. Unfortunately, many organizations identify just a small group of people who are going to specialize in trauma. Well, what happens then when those people leave that organization? Transfer to another district, move out of state, then all of your trauma knowledge just left with that person. So at the trauma responsive stage, it is so critical for the entire school system to have that shared language. And that's how you get to change the culture. This is when things become different. We respond to trauma differently. We prepare for it. We're acting more preventatively. We're not having to respond to as many critical situations because we've changed the way that we're doing it. And then lastly, you get to trauma-informed. And many people say this isn't the stamp of approval and the finish line. You got here, great job. It's more like an ongoing learning process. It's like the aging process. We continue to learn as we go. But once an organization has gotten to this stage, trauma responsive is the norm. That's how they do business. All levels of the system use the trauma-informed principles to guide their decisions. And this school district, who is trauma-informed, would also be reaching out to other organizations with the community to help them in their quest to become trauma-informed. So you see the collaboration happening within the systems to create trauma-informed communities instead of expecting just one organization to be the trauma-informed organization. So as you heard in those phases through the Missouri model, embracing, adopting, and implementing trauma-informed principles was a critical component. So what are trauma-informed principles? Essentially, these principles are going to help people recover from traumatic events. We should assume that when a person has experienced a traumatic event, these things have been violated: safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So it's up to us then to try to infuse trauma-informed principles into our interactions, our policies, the way we make decisions, even how we manage our workforce, as well as how we teach and educate the students. And so let's spend some time digging into what are the trauma-informed principles. This is from the Missouri Trauma Roundtable. They've identified these 5 principles. Safety. This ensures physical, emotional, and cultural safety. Trust is very critical for people who have experienced trauma. So how do we foster a genuine relationship that promotes trust? How do we address the bias and historical mistrust that some students and families have, not just of the education system, but of other systems? That's especially true for marginalized groups who have experienced re-traumatization at the hands of many other systems. Some ways that we establish that trust are simple. We do what we say we're going to do. We set good boundaries. We use transparency so that people can trust us. Choice is another principle. We want to maximize choice and voice. There's a saying, not about us without us. Basically, we wouldn't want to be talking about what we need for them to do without them being at the table to advocate and have voice and choice. So how do we address privilege and power and how that impacts a person's perception on whether they even have a choice? And when they do have a choice, how do we encourage them to take that chance? And how do we tell them, we will support whatever choice you make? The next principle is collaboration. This is trying to minimize the impact of a power differential. We want to do with you, not do to you or do for you. We want to do it with you. We want to equalize the power. Let's maximize collaboration. Let's share the responsibility for decisions, for who gets the credit. This collaboration can mean, how do we collaborate with a family and who they see as supports? How do we collaborate with other professionals within the school district? How do we collaborate with agencies outside of the district that we know that the child and family need for recovery from trauma? And then the last principle is empowerment. People need to feel some sense of power in their life. How do we help them identify strengths and skills that will lead to recovery and a sense of power? How do we recognize and respond to historical trauma and oppression that strips them of that power, even if we've been working to empower them? And so these are trauma-informed principles. And I want you to think about ways that you can use these with students, their families, and also within the workplace. How do we use this with our teachers, our educators? How do we use this with our other supportive staff? We want to create a trauma-informed environment for all, not just for students, but for the people who come to school to serve the students as well. We also want to use trauma-informed principles as universal precaution, as a tier 1 intervention. Everyone deserves to feel safe and trust that people there who are trying to help them will actually help them. Everyone deserves to be empowered, to have some choice and voice, and to be able to collaborate. So we want to offer that as that primary intervention. And then for the people who are at risk, maybe we need to offer something even more for them at the secondary intervention. And then the ones who need trauma-specific services or trauma treatment, perhaps they need even more intense interventions. What we don't want to do is only provide trauma-informed principles to people who report traumatic events to us, because what we need to assume is that there are going to be many people who walk through your school doors or who connect with your staff, who move into your district, who you may never know whether they have a traumatic event or not. They may never report it. So do we really need to know what the trauma is? If we're using trauma-informed principles as a universal precaution, then the details of the traumatic event become less important. And what is more important is that we're treating everyone as if they may have had some adversity. And we're infusing those trauma-informed principles as the standard. Here in the state of Missouri, we are very fortunate to have a guidance document that has been produced by Alive and Well Communities, along with Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, that uses the Missouri model, that developmental framework that we reviewed moments ago. The Missouri model for trauma-informed schools gives us some guidance. Schools can use this document, which you can find on the DESE website. You can find it on DMH's website as well. You can find it on the Missouri School Board Association's website. This Missouri model guidance document can help you set a strategic plan, help you look at all the ways in which your district operates, your school operates, and start to make some decisions about where you currently are and where you need to be along that trauma continuum. So let's look at what the 12 indicators are of a trauma-informed school based on this guidance document. The first indicator is leadership would have trauma knowledge. Again, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that many times there is a very small group of specialized professionals who know about the trauma information, but it is not broadly known across other professions and other positions within a school district. It is critical for leaders to understand trauma and to be behind it. They need to champion this for their buildings, for their districts. The next indicator is equity. How is the district prioritizing equity and using an equity lens to help people who have been experiencing trauma have just as much of an opportunity for successful outcomes as a person who is not experiencing trauma? And what adjustments need to be put in place to help support that person with the additional adversities? The next is student trauma knowledge. Some people get really nervous when we start talking about giving students information about trauma. But just like we want them to know information about basic health and what signs and symptoms are, what to look for in case relationships are unhealthy, we need to also give them information about trauma. There are ways to do that that are developmentally appropriate, no matter what age, what developmental level, but we want to make sure that students get access to the same information. Staff support. This is so critical in becoming a trauma-informed system. So within a school, how could we expect an educator to come to school every day and to treat others in a trauma-informed way if they themselves are not feeling supported? So what supports do we need to put in place? What do we do well already? What are the areas for improvement? What is it that our staff needs that maybe we don't even know? The next indicator is engaging caregivers. Now, a lot of times when people hear this one, they think, oh, parent-teacher conferences, contacting a caregiver for back-to-school night and registration, keeping them involved with Friday folders and other teacher school-to-home communications. Those are very important, of course. But in this context, we're talking about engaging caregivers to be almost an advisory and to help the school district understand ways that they could do trauma-informed work better. Getting parent feedback. Were there things that the school district did that re-traumatized? Are there areas that we could improve on? Some of that can be done through surveys. Some of it can be done through meetings and town halls or events like that. Some school districts invite a parent to be on their trauma team so that you have parent involvement from the very beginning and you're consistently getting their feedback and their perspective. After all, they navigate the school system differently than people who work for the school system. So their experience might be something we can learn from. The next is discipline practices and policies. So earlier I showed that cycle of trauma when it comes to discipline and punishment. And so again, this one can be very controversial because many times school districts have had certain policies in place with how they will address discipline. Restorative justice practices are great ways to begin to change the way that you discipline and use those as learning opportunities. And so this is one of the indicators of a trauma-informed school. The next is student leadership opportunities. And again, in the context of trauma, that would be, how do we engage students who have had adversity, who have overcome some of those adversities? How do we put them in a mentor and a leadership role to advocate for other students or to share what worked for them? And so there are some really creative things that school districts have been doing around peer support, and especially in the secondary education level. So middle school and high schoolers can really become leaders among their peers, especially ones who have a story to tell and feel safe telling that story and can help other people who are experiencing similar problems in the schools. Likewise, we need staff leadership opportunities. That's a critical component as well. And not only do we need to give them the opportunity to lead, we need to create the space. We need to allow for it to happen. And sometimes that means that we have to take other things off of their plate so that they can focus on this instead. Community partnerships are essential to trauma-informed. And part of that is because of what we saw earlier with that pair of ACEs. All of the things that families need to stabilize and recover from trauma, it far exceeds what a school district can provide. So those community partnerships are so important to the school's ability to meet a family's needs outside of the regular school scheduled day or even the school year. And connecting to those other partner agencies can help share some of the responsibilities and can help people grow and understand things differently because you get to hear another perspective and you get to hear from other professions and begin to understand how to put those puzzle pieces together to help families build resilience. Trauma-informed curriculum. So some school districts are really being innovative with how they're weaving trauma-informed into their regular curriculum. Most of this comes from social emotional learning. And there are many, many resources available on social emotional learning curriculum. And there are different ages that you can weave that curriculum in. And so that's an indicator of trauma-informed, is that they're not just getting access to trauma-informed information by going to a school counselor or by going to a discipline or going out to get counseling hours or an assessment done, but they get access to trauma-informed throughout different curricula. They get those social emotional learning opportunities throughout their school day. Human resources and supervision is another indicator that's supporting the staff that really puts pieces into operation so that you can sustain the trauma-informed movement within your school district. And then lastly, an evaluation system is really important for school districts who are moving toward becoming trauma-informed, because you have to know, is this working? Are things improving? Are we seeing new opportunities? Are things staying the same? Are there things that we hadn't even considered that actually take priority first before we get to these other things that we thought we needed to work on? So that evaluation component, it needs to be ongoing and a specific group of people who are looking at it. That's a really important part of your school district moving toward becoming trauma informed. So here's a sneak peek of what that document looks like. It would take those indicators and it would show you those stages of the Missouri model and give you some ideas about what it would look like if your school or your district was in which stage. So I encourage you to use that guidance document, share it among your workforce and your schools, because it can be a very helpful way to move to the next step. Speaking of that, what can administrators do? All right, this information comes from Trauma Sensitive Schools. This is a training package, and if you're not familiar with it, you can find it on safesupportivelearning.ed.gov. They have an online e-curriculum that is open to the public that you can get access to. They have an action guide that you can download that gives you specific steps that you can take, questionnaires, staff surveys, organizational self-assessment, strategic planning templates, a lot of really helpful documents to really move your school in the right direction. Here's some things that administrators can do. Develop an action plan. Communicate your commitment to trauma sensitivity to your schools. Hearing it from leaders makes the world of a difference. Many school districts have a few committed professionals within the school that really value trauma informed. But if administrators aren't on board, you can imagine it takes a very long time for any of those trauma informed initiatives to get off the ground. So hearing it from a leader is a game changer. Also, you can help allocate resources. You can educate the staff about trauma and recovery. And by educate, I don't mean that you specifically are the ones educating them, but linking them up with professional development opportunities and resources would be a great thing that you could do for your school. Creating that trauma-sensitive work group. That's an important part. You want it to be as diverse as possible. Include as many different positions within your school. Try to get a parent. If you work with teenagers and high school students, you may even consider having a student be on the work group. And then assess your school's readiness for change. And again, if you go to that action guide, there's already an assessment there where you could just do a quick survey to get feedback from your school. Other things that administrators can do, and I think this one is really important because many times when people hear an administrator or any person in leadership say, hey, I'm really getting behind this trauma informed, a lot of people think to themselves, okay, so this is the next new thing that I have to do now. And so after 2 years from now, I probably won't even be hearing about this anymore, right? So if you can align trauma sensitivity with other things that you are already doing, and some of it lines up very well, it will help you push that trauma-informed agenda a lot further because people see the connection points instead of people seeing it as an additional unrelated special topic. So some complementary work groups and teams. You may think about teams that are already working on wellness, burnout prevention, restorative practices, PBIS, any committees that are working on emergency planning, even committees that might be working on parent engagement. The list can go on and on. But if you can align those work groups together and help them see where the connection points are, then trauma-informed can feel much more manageable. And your district might be surprised at how many things you're already doing that are in line with trauma-informed work. Also align professional development activities. And then implementation and monitoring processes. So we don't want to have to create a whole new group of people to now monitor this trauma-informed. If there's already a group that are already pulling results and reports and looking at things, can they also align that trauma-informed perspective? Also, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a wonderful resource. This has been around since 2000, established by Congress. It has nationally known experts in trauma who've been contributing for years. There is an e-learning center where you can get curriculum and watch webinars. There is toolkits, resource pages, videos, all kinds of very rich information about childhood trauma and helping systems that focus on youth understand how to become trauma-informed. So here's a list of just some of the topics around the schools and trauma curriculum. There are many more. It's an easy website to navigate. I encourage you to share this with your schools and get access to their information. It will help you along your journey. So they are the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and their website is www.nctsn.org. So that concludes my information about trauma-informed special education. There's more information on our dmh.mo.gov/trauma website. You can reach out to me. I'm happy to coordinate with you or share additional information. I hope this was helpful for you to think about ways that you might be able to assist your schools with becoming trauma-informed. Thank you for the work that you do every day. Reach out to me if you need any assistance, and take good care.